Hello, welcome to the session on the Python if-else statement. Now the if-else statement is going to be one of the most important things you'll learn because it lets you make decisions. It lets you tell Python that do something if something is true or do something else otherwise. So the way this works is, let's take a look at the syntax of the structure of the Python if statement. So we say if, the first part says if a test expression evaluates to something, then you go on based on the evaluation result. So if this is going to be, the expression is going to be true, then you execute this block of code. If the test expression evaluates to false, then this block of code is going to be omitted. We will not execute it. So for an if statement, a colon marks the beginning of the block of code that's going to follow the if statement, and it has to be indented like a standard Python indentation. So there could be multiple statements here. You could have 10, 20, 100. As long as they are indented to the same level below the if statement, then all these statements are going to be forming a part of the block. And if your evaluation is true, only then will these statements run. So let's take a look at this in action. So we are going to define a variable num and say this num is equal to 3. This is the first part. We are setting it up. Now we run the if condition. So if num is greater than 0, here Python is going to evaluate this part. It's an expression which can evaluate to either true or false based on what the actual value of num is. So in our case, we're going to say num is greater than 0. Yes, this is true. So Python is going to run this part, which is the indented part, the code block within the if block. Once it has run this, it's going to come out of the if block. It finds this, so it's going to print this is always printed. So you can see the level difference between the two print statements. This one is part of the if block, this one is not part of the if block. So this statement only runs if the number is actually more than 0. In a second case, we take number is equal to -1, and for the same loop, for the same if construct, this time it's going to evaluate to false. So if num is greater than 0 is not true, in this case it's false. So this indented print statement will not run. The third line, this is also always printed, will get printed irrespective of what the value of num is. So let's run this cell and see. So as you can see, we have in our output 3 is a positive number because of this line which was printed. This is always printed comes because of this second line. This was printed because it is not part of the if statement. Then we get this is also always printed, which is this last line over here. And as you can see, in this particular case, this print num is a positive number did not get printed because it never got a chance, because this statement evaluated to false. It evaluated to false, so Python went straight to the last line here. So we've got 4 print statements, but only 3 have been run. Take a minute, have a look. Next we come to an extension of the if statement, and that is called the if-else statement. So here we are telling Python that if a condition is true, you do these things, but if it is not true, then you can go ahead and do those other things that we are going to tell you. So it's just like English. If true, if this evaluates to true, then you go ahead and do the statements which are contained within the body of if. And then you say else. So else is going to be run only if this is false. Once you come to else, then these are the statements identified by the indent. So else on itself is not going to evaluate anything. It's a default setting for whenever if becomes false. So if it is true, you run this. If it is false, you run this. Let's take an example and see how it works. So we decide num is equal to 3, and then we say if num is greater than or equal to 0, then you print positive or 0. Else, without evaluating anything further, else you print negative number. So in our example, num is 3. So we are going to have a true outcome of this expression. Therefore we are going to print positive or 0. And once that is done, once it is true and this statement has been executed, then Python will not even look at the else part of it, because the else comes into play only if the expression evaluated within the if has come to false. Let's evaluate, let's run the code and see. So as expected, we are going to get positive or 0 because the num was 3. Let's change this here, and you can do it yourself when you get the sheet. Let's make it -5. Run it again, and now we got negative number. So this shows you when it was -5, this evaluated to false, which led to Python jumping over everything within the if and going straight to the else bit of it. Right? Now we can extend it further using what is called the elif bit. So let's see how elif works with if else. So what elif does is it lets you put in another if condition after the first if condition. So it is basically saying else if. How this works through Python is, Python says if this is true, I'm going to evaluate this. Otherwise I will come to elif, and then because it's an if within the else, elif has a if within it, it's going to again evaluate something. Remember, in else we were not evaluating anything, but in elif we evaluate. If it is true, we continue. If it is false, we jump to the else. And the interesting thing is you can have any number of elifs. So it can keep on going through one elif to the next, evaluating whether it is true or not. If it is true, it will run that particular block of elif. If it is false, it will go straight to else. Let's see an example. Now we have got num set to 3.4. We say if num is greater than 0, we print positive number. Else we check again. If num is exactly equal to 0, we print 0. And if both these conditions have evaluated to false, then Python is going to jump to the else statement. So let's run it and see. So we get an output of positive number with 3.4 because this is the bit that got run. Let's change it to 0. Let's see what happens here. We make it 0, run it again. Now it's showing us 0 because what happened was this part was not worked because this was false, but this part got triggered. Num was in fact actually equal to 0, so we were able to print 0. And once we did something within this whole of if elif else block, once some block has been executed, anything after that does not get executed. So this is how the if, elif and else bit works. Now you can also nest the if statements, which becomes very, very powerful. Let's take an example of a nested if statement. Now I'm not going to talk to you about input just now. Let me first explain how the nested bit is working. So just ignore this for a minute. We take this. If num is greater than or equal to 0, then what do? You go within the loop code, and once you have entered the indented block, you already know that it is greater than or equal to 0, then you check again. So you check again. If it is exactly 0, then you're going to print 0. If this is false, this within the indentation bit is false, then you jump to the else within the indentation. You do not jump to the last else. You jump to the else that is contained within this if block. So this is a nested if block. We know that the number is either 0 or positive because of this block. Now we are trying to decide whether to print 0 or positive. But if this turns out to be false, then we can jump straight to this else block. So this is how this bit of code is going to run. Now let me talk about the input bit. What input does is it lets you interact with the Python system dynamically. So when we say input, it's going to throw me a prompt and ask me to enter a number. Let's run this cell and see what happens. So you can see here is the prompt. This string that I passed to the input function is going to appear here, and it's invoking me. It's telling me give me a number, and I'm going to store the number, whatever you give it to me, in the num variable. Now you can see the structure of this sentence here. We used a float type conversion, and the reason we did that was that whenever input takes a value from the user, it always takes it as a string, and we cannot run a string through our system here. So we have to first convert it to a float, and then we can run this. So let me give it a value. Let's say I give it 3, press enter. So now it's gone through the whole chain and it's given me an outcome. It says positive number, which is obviously correct. Let's see how it worked. So num got hold of the number 3 which I entered, and it was greater than or equal to 0, so it chose to enter this block. Because this was true, it did not go into this bit at all. So once it entered this block here, because it was true, it then checked whether num was exactly equal to 0. In this case it was not, it was 3. So this statement was not printed. The code jumped to this else bit here, and then it said print positive number, so that is what it did. Now we'll run the cell again with a negative number and take a look. Let me pass it -6. Now it's given me a negative number outcome, which is again a correct outcome, and now you can follow the chain of logic very clearly. We used input, we got -6, which was converted to a float, and it became num. This is the variable it was stored in. Python evaluated this, it was false. Because it was false, this whole bit was ignored, and we jumped from here straight to this else. And then this else, of course the else statement does not evaluate anything, it just goes and prints whatever, it executes whatever code is there in this block. So we got a negative number. Now I'm going to show you something interesting, and this is, let me run this cell again. I'm going to pass it 0. Enter a number, let's give it 0, and it prints 0. So our code is working perfectly. I hope you enjoyed that. Take care, and I'll see you in the next session.